Powerhouse. I am a poet, a playwright, an actress, um, a dancer, what I would call a freedom dancer. I use a lot of movement in my work to extend the words and the feelings, and use the use of body and movement.
My name is Reggie Walker. I'm a counselor and a spiritual guide.
Question. Excuse me. Hi, sorry to bug you. Do you know?
My name's Cairo Miles, and yeah, I'm an artist.
Yeah, I think poetry has been my first introduction to expressing art and feeling. I think that I remember my first poem, and I didn't really. I guess in my teens I started to own that I'm a poet type of thing, and then once I got to that, then I went to the high school for performing arts and I majored drama, and then acting became like the thing that I do, and then everything else kind of like falls under that umbrella.
We grow up in a culture, a society, where people are taught to believe that they are their minds, their bodies, and their egos. And what I help them to do is to dispel that lie, I won't call it a myth, but that lie, that misconception of who they are, and to recognize that they are spirit, and then to connect them to that living reality which exists at the source of who they are within themselves.
I am a community artist, so I'm a teaching artist currently, and I teach young people film, photography, graphic design, general arts, installation, and visual arts.
For a while, I was performing more than I was writing. Um, and late, it's kind of been like an equal give and take. It's what I create, put it out there. Versus sometimes I think that I keep creating and thinking that, oh, I need to put more, I need to write more. But sometimes it's to take what you've written and find its way to release, versus like just keep writing new material and not giving it its space to really like show up as freely. So yeah, I basically allow the writing and the performance to kind of like work hand in hand versus like challenge each other.
Well, I think basically it's to take people through the steps of knowing that they can't be their mind belongs to them, that they can watch their mind in action. So they are the witness, they are the observer, they are spirit or consciousness. And the same with the body. The body is not them, they're in the body. And I demonstrate that to them. Recognize that when they're asleep, when the body is like at rest, there's always a part of them that is awake. That part knows if they dreamed, whether the dreams were good or bad, exciting or not. So they begin to recognize that there is a difference between who they are and what they're in, namely the body and the mind and the ego. They start to recognize that the ego is a creation of the mind, and that is the Trojan horse of the mind, that it operates to fulfill the desires of the mind. And we get caught up in that, and in the process of getting caught up in that, we start to identify the mind as ourselves, because we are beginning, as we grow in this society, in this culture, to forget who we are in truth, that we are spirit. So the mind takes over, and through its surrogate, the ego, it begins to run our lives.
So I came to Baltimore about 3 years ago to go to a program called Community Arts to get my MFA in community art. So I came here, and as a part of my program, we are supposed to do a residency, an artist residency, and I started working with the Baltimore United Viewfinders about 3 years ago in my artist in residency, and decided after I graduated and into my thesis year to stay. So I work in East Baltimore, and I started doing multiple projects, and I thought that my work was not complete. I felt like many artists come to Baltimore, come to the communities in which I find myself in, and they do a little bit of work, they get what they need to get, and then they leave. And so a part of being a community artist is actually figuring out how you have shared leadership and investment, not just in terms of your time, but how do you create art and change. And so a part of it is like putting in a little bit more time.
That goes back a couple eons, if I could put it very briefly. I had been wondering for so many years, there must be more to us than blood and guts. There must be more to us than a brain and 5 senses, because I had heard and seen so many miraculous things that people had performed, had done. And I knew that wasn't just the 5 senses that we know and the brain allowing that experience. So I began to study. I began to think on these things. I began to question my belief system, because it was my belief system, I came to understand, that caused me to have this limited outlook about human potential. Whatever I was raised with as a child is what I had been living with, whether it came from family, friends, movies, TVs, church, school, whatever. I had been limited by those beliefs to accepting their definition of who I am. And then one night, while I was reading, I slipped in, I nodded off, first of all, and I slipped into a corner of myself where I had never been. And the first thing that hit me was this humongous sound, this roar like the sound of a jet engine. And it just overwhelmed me. But I didn't know what it was at the time. I just knew that this great sound, and I remember in my spirit falling back. And that was the beginning when I came out of that experience. And when I saw this light, I also saw, when I experienced this sound, like the sound of a jet engine, I also saw a light that flashed. And the light changed from red to green to yellow. And each time the light would change, like a slide in a projector, I would see a different part of my life. And what that said to me was, you have made nothing happen. Everything has happened to you. And I was devastated. I was wiped out because I thought I was making decisions. I thought I was consciously, intentionally making decisions. But I was really a product of my belief system and my conditioning. So the next morning after this experience, I got up and I couldn't stand up straight. I was bent over like an old man. And I realized something was definitely wrong with me. So I walked around about a mile to my mother's house. Because my mother had psychic insight. And she tended not to use it very often because she had been taught growing up that that's some devil stuff, that's something you shouldn't be involved with, so she didn't. But when she saw my condition and I explained to her how I had got lost the night before, she sat up in bed. I was sitting on the end of her bed. She sat up in bed and looking at me, but just above my head. She said, I see an old man standing over you. He's pressing down on your shoulders. He's trying to take over. Don't let him. Fight him. So it was from that moment that I actually began my journey of awakening. I realized that there was something that was me that I did not know or recognize, that I had not nurtured or helped to have expression through me, that I had been operating through this thing called the mind. And the mind had its own separate agenda. The mind is basically, without direction from a higher order of consciousness or spirit, it's pretty much connected with the material dimension, this physical world. And so you're going to be limited in many ways by that consciousness. So I recognized over time that I had to free myself from identifying my mind as myself. So that was the beginning of my spiritual awakening. And during that process, my ego died. It collapsed, as it were. And I thought, because I identified with my ego up to this time, that my ego was me. I thought that I had died. I wasn't able to differentiate between me as spirit, as higher consciousness, and the ego through the mind that had been directing my life. So when it died, I pretty much fell apart, because that was the only me I knew. And I remember going to New York on a bus one day after the experience of this death and the beginning of an awakening, which I did not and then recognize that it was the beginning of the awakening by the death of the old, making way for the new. And I remember saying to myself, my life has been phony. I've been a pretender. I've led other people to believe these false things. I have lived out of my delusion of who I am, and I've supported others in doing that. And I felt so embarrassed. that self-hatred was so profound, self as in small self, not the higher self, that I decided, I should just end it all. I should just get rid of myself. And then a voice from within, the first time I heard what I came to call the voice of salvation, said to me, you can't be that selfish.
It's a discovery, the poetry. I find that, and that whether it's talking about womanhood, sexuality, heritage, culture, the poetry has its own theme. When I write new work, I don't normally say I'm going to write about this. It becomes my feelings, depending on how I feel about the topic itself. I write the feelings. I describe so I think the main is just how I process, how I see the world through feelings versus describing the actual, I guess it is the same thing, but yeah, it's just allowing myself to really feel the piece in itself.
So I think that Baltimore is a very interesting annex of poverty and wealth. And because of that, there's a lot of landscape and a lot of people who are going through multiple and dueling oppressions in their lives. And as artists, sometimes we find inspiration from that which is outside of ourselves, or that we, want to see the happening thing. And so poverty sometimes is that. And in that, artists come and they take pictures, or they come and they start a project, and it's not clear sometimes to the community in which they are working with how long they're going to stay, what they're going to do, what they're giving back in that. And so oftentimes we come and we take our pictures and we do our paintings and we do our exhibitions, or we, make projects, but they have no long lasting effect in the communities other than we have our piece of artwork, and the people may get a book, or they may get a copy of the painting, and then we are off selling our artwork in some other capacity somewhere else. And so it doesn't oftentimes, from what I've seen, help the community in which it was derived from. And what I try to do in my work is to do art that is socially engaged, but also that changes not only myself, but also the community in which it serves, and also that there's shared leadership. So when I leave, the things that I create, some facet of it, if not the whole thing, can be sustained not by me.
When I did my audition for the high school for creative and performing arts, my monologues to memorize was one in Tashaki Shange for colored girls, and one of the no assistants. And then there was Agnes of God. And having that being my emotional space at 15 years old, I didn't realize what no assistance meant. You water the plant your damn self. Like, I didn't know, but I think that once I got the response from the directors, I found that, like, wow, this is cool. Like, you have like this character and you have all this emotional life and this character, and you're telling the story and you're feeling all these things, but you still have to get the story out, which was like fascinating to me.
At that moment, I just leaned against the window of the bus as it bounced along the highway, and I cried because I sighed, knowing that I wasn't that selfish. I was just so broken and afraid. But my family would be the ones who suffered the shame and loss once I was gone. So I cried because I knew at the age of 26, I was going to have to start over with my life. And that was the beginning of my journey of real self-discovery. I read Edgar Cayce. I read Carl Jung. I read a number of other spiritual guides and teachers. But what I was doing then is trying to find out what the hell had happened to me. And I remember going to a 10-session Hindu guru's presentation about spirituality at the University of Pennsylvania. And after the series, we could meet with him for a moment. That's how they do that. And so his name was Swami I don't remember, Dayananda. I think it was Dayananda. And I said, so I described to him my experience of hearing this horrendous sound that just blew me away, and this flashing light. And he said to me, he said, you saw your mind. And that was it. He didn't say more or less. And so I had to, begin that journey. But
shared leadership is basically taking what, for me as an artist, what is personal. Sometimes my art is very personal, and taking that design process and putting it on the table for everybody to have a vested interest in shaping what the outcome is. And so currently I'm the director of a program called Over East, and that program is an intergenerational open mic that partners exhibition space and placemaking space and performance space and workshop space all at one time, every month. And that space takes a lot to do if it was just one person. It takes a lot more to do when there's like a team of people. And there's a team of people, and those people are made up of people who live in that community, who are actually telling me, well, what do we need to learn as artists? What is actually going on in our community? How do we address the issues that are going on in our community through art, and how do we have those conversations? So every facet of Over East is intentionally created and informed by the people who live in the community in which it serves, and also informed in terms of how we develop programming. And so when I initially started Over East, before even writing a grant or getting what we needed to create it, I had to find community members that were going to invest in it. And that means that if Over East is to sustain itself in any kind of way, when I walk away from it, a community member can sustain it themselves.
Honestly, I did a lot of ensemble pieces when I was in high school. When I got out, it's just something about how when I did my poetry, it felt like I liked that energy of being on the stage by myself. So I guess in some way it was like poetry gave me this like voice that I can do this. This is a poem spoken through me. And then I was like, let me take it a step further in what this one person would look like to have. And it was a challenge, you know, it's like one person having all these stories to tell with through all these characters. And I started to investigate, like research solo work, solo artists, and I found there's like a whole plethora of people who does that type of work, and which was great for me because I was like, oh wow, I like that. Not that I'm opposed to doing ensemble work, but it challenges me, it pushes me, it stretches me, and it allows me to own my craft in such a way that where how I see it, how I feel, and give me the opportunity to have freedom in the imagination, like, and with these characters.
What our focus this year is a lot of like artist, language, entrepreneurship. How do we use art to solve our own problems? So those were a couple of things. And so our event usually starts out with finding what actual artists are here in the community, whether it is in Baltimore proper, whether it is in DMV, and then whether it is also in the community. So we find artists that are range from, at this point, 7 to 70 for our featured artist, and we go through the vetting process of like finding different artists, and then we invite those artists to do a video to talk about them being a participant in Over East. So that's the beginning part of it, is like telling them what's going on, acclimating them to like what it is to do a show, asking them do they want to teach a workshop as a part of their art, so on and so forth. So when you come into Over East, like our artists feel like they get an opportunity to be engaged with as artists, and some of them have not. Some of them have, but some of them haven't. Some of them, they just draw at home, and they've never had a show that was curated. They've never gotten on a mic and, you know, understood like what it means to like sign a release form because somebody is, you know, using your work, or so on and so forth. So we take them through that specific process. When you come in as just like a performer or a person who's giving art in our space. And then there's the other component, which is our workshop space. And so usually we have, in the beginning of the year, a vetting process of what is actually relevant in the community, and what do artists need, what do people need, what kind of conversations need to be had. And then we create a series of workshops, whether that's silk screening, whether that's talking about gentrification, whether that's talking about food justice. We'll do a workshop with another artist. So that's not just our featured artists who usually do performances and things like that, or they're exhibiting in the gallery. They come and they teach. So we'll have, you know, different kind of dialogues. We did one that is still going on where we built a chalkboard structure where you put your face in it and it says, I am excellence. And then you write down what that means to you, and then you take a picture. Just with your face in the black and white cutout, and those will all be exhibited together, so people come and they actually get to make art as well. And then you have your exhibition component, so we vet again like other artists in the community. Like if you want to have sculpture, you'll come and say, hey, we want to have sculpture, how do we put it in the gallery space? Or we want to do cartoons, this superheroes or whatever. So we'll have actually an exhibition that's hung up in the gallery, and it usually is hung for about a month until the next Over East is happening, because we share a space with college students, with grad students, and so sometimes we'll combine those two shows, different things like that. And then we have our performance spaces. You'll see like sometimes we'll have dancers, sometimes we'll have just people come in off the street and they'll come in and they'll tell their stories, and then we'll have actual feature artists. And they get to be on our flyers, things like that. They are on our social media, things like that. And then they get also...
This insight or proverb or wisdom sayings, as I call them, is crime and punishment. We all have a definition of what that means in our minds, because we've heard that title before somewhere. And then the insight says, when you break the will of another, you both become cripples. So then they say, oh shit, crime and punishment, that falls on me. Because they had already set up a definition for that, which means the conscious mind is trapped because it already given a statement. That's the ego and the mind. And then I go, whoosh, and they can't deny it because it goes right by that, right to the heart of who they are. When you break the will of another, you both become cripples. So if you're there, it's going to hit you. Well, that too, I hadn't thought of that. Crime and punishment means, to me, you do the crime, you serve the time. Here's another one. Deaf and dumb. It has icons on either side, two statue heads, right? And it says, those who can't hear are deaf, but those who refuse to listen to their self are dummies. There's a lot of humor, but it's always to the point. You understand what I'm saying? How, if I move to that higher level of consciousness, then in what I say, one may pop up, and then I will stop and write it down. It's like fishing. The age of Pisces was the age of the Christ. His symbol was the fish, a divine idea. When he told his followers to go out into the river, sea, whatever, and, fish. And they said, well, we've already been out there. There's nothing that's there to catch. And he said, metaphorically, we must understand the holy books and not literally. He said, go out further and go deeper. And all of a sudden, so many fish came up that they filled the boat. He's not talking about physical fish. He's talking about divine ideas, things that empower, liberate, heal people. And then when they got back to shore, he said, forget about them goddamn fish. What did he say? I'm going to make you a fisher of men. Heavy stuff when you really understand what it's all about. So that's wherever I was coming and going with that. It really talks about how we're messing up the planet because we are asleep at the wheel. We're supposed to be the stewards of this realm, this planet. We're behind the wheel just like somebody on the highway sleep. Think we're driving, but a damn dead sleep.
Yeah, it's entitled The Art of I Am, and I've been hashtagging I Am just, but the evolution really came from about a year or two ago. Someone wanted me to do a show, and at the time I didn't feel like I had something equipped for that particular audience. But I felt like, okay, the title came to me, The Art of I Am. And it was like, oh, brilliant. And it was like, brilliant. But I didn't know what that meant. And as time was going on, as I was kind of researching within myself, like, what does that mean? I was like, I want to give people this evolution of how you get to discovery of your full self. And bad or good or indifferent, you have these experiences that make you up to who you are. And the art of I am is like remembering all of these different details about yourself, and being so transparent with it, and being able to tell the truth to yourself, and then creating this project and presenting it to the world. It's like everybody has to take that journey to I am. Actually, it was the Center of Peace, my spiritual community, and you don't never say no to them. So, and it was like, oh, I want you to do this hour long, and I'm like, a lot of my work it spoke in terms of poetry, but not like a 1 hour experience. So I just was like, okay, I need to create something, or something. It felt like something created through me, like, because once I had the art of I am, I didn't know until after I did it at the Center of Peace, that I felt like, oh, this is something good. This is like bridging the spirit, the human evolution, the ancestral, and all these type of components that I embrace in my work together. And it's like, wow, this is what I want to do, and each time that I've done it have kind of shifted or added a little bit more texture, if you will, to this piece. I am is a global idea. I want to take it from Philly to New York to Africa to different places. I think that that have this idea of connecting people and celebrating stories, and this one that I'm doing it in New York is a universal solo festival, so it's only for solo artists. So like, I found a place where not only that it's a place where I can perform, but it's other people around the world that's coming to this festival, which is an Off-Broadway production. So my hope is to have a longer run, in terms of like a 1 week run or some in different places. I think that and my other goal is to give people, like Spartan young people or women, opportunity to write their own story or journey to I am. How they get to learn and accept and discover their I am.
Nothing changes. Now, back here, I know your daughter took a picture.
I think that working with viewfinders and working in East Baltimore in particular changed my artwork. One, it reminds me to create. So I'm an installation artist. I build large, like, altar spaces, and I am a visual artist and I'm a poet. It reminds me of the importance of, like, utilizing art to actually change my own conditions, because I can't preach it if I don't actually employ it in my own life. So I think that's one thing that it taught me, but it also taught me that art is a really, like, as free as it sometimes seems. It doesn't mean that it's like a necessity. It's like when you are in a community where the option to have an imagination, the option to create is stifled and also made very hard, like inaccessible, you realize like how privileged you are. So I think for me, that was the biggest part of it. Previously as an artist, like I did primarily art about queer people or art about myself or art about things that still matter to me, I think, but I didn't always understand the relationship that there are people who are hungry, and art does not seem like it is something that is tangible or even useful when you're hungry or you have 6 kids and you are working a minimum wage job and you can't pay your rent. Art doesn't seem like it is something that, it seems like a frivolous excess, and it's excessive. But what I realize in doing the work that I do and informing my own work is that it actually isn't. It's a way of healing from all of those things in a day. Because I do like work with people who are sometimes in situations way worse than me, I realize the necessity in it because sometimes it's the only time where you can create a different outcome. If your whole neighborhood is being demolished and you no longer have your house, like I was working on a mural project last year and the woman, she had literally a tree growing through her house and her father brought that house and she traded it in with a development company to get a new house. But her old house was demolished. All those memories of her brothers and sisters, of her father coming here from the South and working, all those things were like gone. And when I sat down with her to do interviews and when I sat down with her to ask her about the process of art, she really didn't understand how it could change her. And then sitting down with her over a period of time, she was like, oh, like I got to relive all of these memories. I get to put this memory now on the side of my house in a mural. I get to have a practice of my own. Like she started journaling and she started like wanting to make little videos on her phone and realizing that it opened up a different world to her that she didn't feel like before she even had access to or even knew could exist. And I think the same thing for myself is like going to school, going to work. In my own artwork, I sometimes forget to come home and actually make. Not just make with people or make in my work. It reminds me to keep to my own personal artwork. And most recently, I was shot in my foot, and that's the only thing that I could do. I couldn't go to work. I couldn't interact with my kids. I couldn't do so many different things. I couldn't even walk. And get up, go to the bathroom. So what did I have? I had a pen and a pencil. I had, some watercolor, some gouache, and some acrylic paint. And my camera and iPad. So and what could I create from the place when I felt like I was immobile and I didn't have very, very many choices? It definitely shapes my understanding of my art in a very different way. And it also allows me to be courageous and take risk. Before I did it, I just did what I knew best, what I was most trained in. And now I do whatever. Like if I want a wood burn, I just bought a wood burner. I have an airbrush machine that I got for my birthday. I'm, gonna do some more mural stuff, like larger mural things, like things that I never thought that I could tackle myself alone as an artist. I think in my own personal work, I have expanded my imagination of what I can actually do and just try.
We're on a crash course with reality. So that's what Sleep at the Wheel does. But I said, I don't want to go that deep, that hard, that heavy with the first one. Spirit said, do your humor, because you know, you're known for humor. People always laugh when you say, or even when you get ready to say, people laugh. So do humor. And I was like, what can I say? I was like, do humor. So this has more wit and humor in it. This one, when I go back and clean it up and move ahead with that. And then I wrote this one. This was the first one I wrote. It's little. You are the rainmaker. Power again. Our true identity, recognizing who we are and the power that we inherently have. It's insights. The inner genie hears the magic words, I am, and it is done. I am the norm. I am the source of happiness. It's things like that. You alone are ultimately responsible for who you are and the quality of your life. About mastery, because I'm damn sure I'm not no master of myself. But I guess that's what people talk about. I'm just, at this point, I'm trying to get, well, I am awakening people to their potential.
Right.
Jesus, Buddha, all of them, they ain't come here to be worshiped. They came here to show, to demonstrate the vast potential of humans. And he said, look, you can do this too. And people say, oh, no, that's okay. I'd rather like worship you. Bullshit on that. Pick up these lessons, learn from them, and live a full life. That's your inheritance, a full life. The kingdom, quote unquote, of God within. Well, first of all, I hear you. I think I'm glad you're doing it this way. I think first of all is self-recognition, which is hard. Then self-acceptance, which is harder. Then the courage, the will, the desire, the passion, the determination to live out the truth that you are, knowing that you are a singular force, spirit, operating in that way in the world, although it's only one force, but as that individual personality being expressed through that individual personality, you feel it's me and it's all of that, because most people are like poo-poo, you know, what is this? Who do you think you are? You know, how can you step to stuff like that? So that's why I did Know Thyself. Look at all the other people. Deal with them. This is what they've been saying for eons. So it is self-mastery when you get there. I don't think you have to be a master to express it. If we wait for people to be masters, then we'll have very few teachers.
The second time and third time I had the dynamic of the mother and father piece came into play. With my mother making her transition to an ancestral realm in September of 2015, that kind of propelled me to get what the afterlife, the having her for so long, and then physically now spiritually having her, like, so I added stories and texture to the piece like that. I've allowed the particular character of the grandmother to, with what was decided as her disability, to really be, to really have her use her instrument as the place where the wisdom and the reminder of the main character to kind of like come into herself. Having the grandmother be in her disability allowed a lot of interesting moments, because sometimes we think that it should come when we get information or when we get like inspired. It should come from a certain type of thing, like a prepackaged, perfect. But even through the difficulty of how my grandmother had to process life, she still had a plethora of wisdom that came through from her. Yeah. Being that this show is in October, which I've been like just trying to figure out how, as I prepare for this New York debut, if you will, finding nuances along the way, whether or not partnering with organizations where I get to teach different self-scripting monologues to different people, whether or not I perform a little snippets of these different things. Because I think that being that it's showing up or debuting in New York is really big and huge for me. So I think preparing for that moment is just allowing, just to keep the work going, just finding various ways to kind of like speak to the work that I'm doing.
I'm planning a show, but more importantly, like I have done a series of poems and writings, and then I did a bunch of like different pen work. So I did a lot of that kind of stuff of like just sketching out what happened for myself. Like how did I experience this thing? Because it happened not only just to me, but it happened to my roommate. And so we were walking down the street, 2 people came and robbed us, and then one decided he was going to turn around and shoot me. So in that way, the experience for me, I remember a lot of the details. I remember a lot of what happened. My roommate has no details at all. They don't remember anything. And so in that experience, it's like, well, kind of reliving that experience and putting it into something that's tangible for me to be able to walk through is really, I don't know, I don't really even know if it was therapeutic, but it also is like a prayer. I do believe that art is also the closest for me that I understand God to be, because you can create and you can destroy and you can do everything else in between in your art. An artist has an extreme amount of power in what we wield and how we are able to shift culture and what people understand of the world, and sometimes even themselves. Like we are like magicians in that way, conjurers in that way. So for me, going through the actual event of what happened to me in January and drawing it out, displaying it out, and then going through and putting in what I want. So I put in wings in some places, and I put in feet in some places walking where they were. And I took out holes, and I made a space for my own self in that, because I felt like I didn't have a space in that narrative. It was like, oh, somebody took something from me. So there was like also a reclaiming of myself and my own space and my own artwork. But I don't think I would have been able to do that if it wasn't for me having that avenue of my art.
Action.
I think that it is in my work, but it's in my work. And there's a lot of other emotions in my work. I think that I am less angry with the boy that shot me and the system, and more angry at the system that created him and also allows for him to, one, not have any consequences, two, that stole this promise anyway. Like, I feel like the two boys that robbed me and my roommate had no promise. They didn't really feel like there was any other alternative. And because I work in Baltimore and because I work with young people, I realize how clear that line and that divide is for young people. They feel like they have very little options and very little choice in who they will become. And everything else around them encourages them to be a criminal, encourages them to do deplorable things. Like, if just the way that the testing works, the way that it works where many kids don't have a place to go after a certain period of time, the poverty, there's a huge gap in Baltimore in wealth, like in education. There's like rich, and then there's poor, and then there's maybe a working class, middle class, like trying to figure it out in between. But that's very fluid, way more than the very clear concrete lines that are created here. And left in that are a whole bunch of children who don't really feel like they have any choices. And it's not like the law gives them very many options, or the city gives them very many options, and oftentimes their parents have very few options either. And so for me, like, that's what I kind of got angry at. And I also got angry because I feel like as a black person trying to negotiate this system, it made it very clear that there's no difference.
No, I don't consider myself a writer. I now acknowledge that I've written a book. I think of a writer as someone, that's their passion, that's their profession, that's something that they're drawn to, they do all the time, and that's the way they express themselves. Well, I'm primarily a verbal person, not, a literary person. But what brought me to it is very interesting. I was sitting in the garden of our home. We used to live in a place where we had a big garden, stone walls, 2 levels, lower, sunken garden, and then up some steps in the back area. Very, very nice. The house was built in 1750, the oldest part, and then the newer part was built in 1850. So it was a very nice property. I was sitting in the garden with one of my students, and we were just discussing the role of the ego as the Trojan horse, of fooling us, taking over our life, and then, we find ourselves in a world of trouble quite often. And we laughed about it because we dug, that's how the ego works. It's always running the game. So after the discussion, this student went off to Arizona for some seminar or something. And during that time, I felt compelled to write this thing that became known as identity theft. I had no idea about no book or anything. It's just this little piece, like a page or two, called Identity Theft. And it was about this entity named Sola, an A on soul, who was born into wealth and riches, the greatest wealth and riches one could be born into. And at some point during his life, he became curious about the outer world. And he became so enamored of that he eventually left his estate, his grand estate. And prior to his leaving, he spoke to the head man, the one who was in charge. and that was the mind. And he asked Headley, please take care of my property as if it were your own. And Headley had a servant, and the servant was the ego. I can't think of the ego's name right now. I could look it up if that's germane. But he went off and he went in search. After a while, he forgot who he was. See, when you lose touch with your source, eventually you will forget who you are. And then he had this yearning, this emptiness. He started yearning to find this thing he was missing. And he was looking in the outside world rather than within himself. And he made a commitment. He made a decision that he would not return home to his grand estate where he was whole, complete, and happy for no reason. He needed nothing. Everything that he wanted and needed was in his grand estate. He said he would not return to his grand estate until he found that missing something that he needed to feel whole and complete again. So he went on this journey for a number of years, eventually having experienced one thing and then another, and nothing ultimately, permanently bringing him satisfaction. He came to the realization, finally, that nothing of permanence can be found in an impermanent world. And that insight freed him to return home. He remembered home then. So he came back to his grand estate. And when he got there, there was a little plate aside the door that says ring bell for entry. And he rang the bell, and the ego, the servant, whose name I can't think of right now, he came to the door and he said, yes, can I help you, sir? And of course, Sola said to the servant, it's me, the Lord and Master of this estate. Sola, I've returned home. And the servant said to him, I'm sorry, I do not recognize or acknowledge you. The only master of this estate is my master, Headley. The servant then turned and slammed the door in his face and left. He left with Sola in frustration. He started to bang on the door. Open up, let me in. You know, he wanted to enter, but he couldn't. He became discouraged, and then he turned, and ultimately, what the story says, he re-entered the world of lost souls from where he had so recently come. And that form, that entity that was designed to serve him, had assumed his place, his grand estate. Basically, that's the way it went. So that took a couple days or whatever to write it, you know, because it was just coming out. And what I learned from that was this, that the creative force, the divine, what some call God, what others call the good, the spirit, is also known as the trickster. That's one of the names of this universal force. And I was tricked, see, because I was, you know, compelled, drawn into writing this little page-and-a-half parable, identity theft. And I thought, okay, that's it, I'm done. And then some weeks or months later, another part came up. So it was like 10 or 15 pages, and it was called The The Journey to Freedom. And the subtitle was The Hero's Journey. And I remember I had read Joseph Campbell, the great American mythologist, and he had talked about the hero's journey. And when I went back and read him, I realized that I had already undertaken and accomplished at least a phase of the hero's journey. So that was the subtitle of my spiritual autobiographical sketch. That was 14 pages. But am I thinking book? No. I did it, and that was done. And then finally, something that I had started to do back in the 80s presented itself full force in my mind. And it was these proverbs that I've written. I've written like, I guess, about 8,000 now. But they started to present themselves. So after looking at the proverbs and saying, well, you got all of these, throw it in there anyway. I'm still not saying book because I never heard of a book like that. You know, a page and a half for a parable, 14 pages for a little sketch of a spiritual autobiography, and then some insights. I was like, this seems crazy to me. But what I had to learn during that whole experience is to surrender to spirit, surrender to guidance. You obviously don't know, you're blind, but I, the true you, sees and knows, and I am the great I am, leading you through this. You just need to surrender. So I was still fighting. Well, I'll put 50 of them together, the Proverbs. And when I would put them together, they would not sit still. They would start moving and shaking and pushing. And I would be like, well, what the hell's happening here? And, you know, then I would squeeze them in again, meaning any that was trying to get in there that shouldn't be in there in my small mind, my lesser mind, I would push it back out and say, no, it's supposed to be 50, like I knew. And then one day I was messing around with something called a book. I would never call it a book back then. And then it came to me, this is a book of insights. This is a book of Proverbs. This is a book of wisdom sayings. And the first two parts were preambles to the gift that you brought back from your hero's journey. This unique gift of these wisdom sayings, these Proverbs. And then I stopped trying to control them and let them grow to their natural evolution. And then slowly I started to think, well, damn, this ain't like nobody else's book. And then Jerry said, but you ain't like nobody else. You do things the way you do. But I said, but I don't want to be embarrassed, you know, talking about I got a book and it's a little this, a little this, and a little that, you know, like a wildebeest, you know. So then, when I recognized that what it was, not as a book, but this pattern that was there from the very beginning through me, through the insights, I saw that this was a journey of remembering who we are in truth. This book is about identity, finding one's true identity and letting go of that which is false. So then the final section came, Know Thyself. Know Thyself is a compilation of about 20 internationally known, historically recognized authorities who spoke on the divine within, about spirit, of man as God, as man as God. And I was like frightened. I was like, whoa, you know, I don't know if I'm going to go there and say something like that. I said, but I'm not saying it. St. Augustine is saying it. Jesus is saying it. This one is saying it. That one is saying it. You know, you're just putting that forth so people can see that you're just not making stuff up. That other people have either made stuff up or had the experience and verified this truth. So that's the final piece of what has become Life is Funny, but it ain't no joke.
So I'm doing some collaborative work about gender and about the intersections between gender and divinity and class. I have a friend who is a painter, and I do installation art and I paint. And like, how do we collaborate in talking about those relationships? And then also like the relationship where race makes that a whole lot more complicated. So that is one of the like projects that I find to be important, because I find that as an artist and as a person in general, I'm on a crossroads in my own journey, and as genderqueer. So I identify as gender variance, if you might say, better term, that there's no real clear destination, that there's not a real destination between that which is female and that which is male. I'm somewhere on a trajectory, I feel like. And that those energies are, in the way they manifest it in myself, are something that they move around, they move up, around, and down. But I probably am closer to the masculine spectrum most of the time. And so I feel like that also informs my work. It also informs like what I want to understand, because many of the people that are very important to me also have a same kind of relationship. Even if it's not that theirs is exactly like mine, they're somewhere on that trajectory themselves.
No, I work at Amtrak, which is great because it gives me opportunity to be like seeing and connecting and interacting with a whole plethora of them. There, usher. I make the announcements, trains announcements at 30th Street Station, Philadelphia. And my last show, I had like a few of my customers come to see me, which was great. And what's interesting about working at Amtrak at the station, when I'm making announcements, like people don't know anything about me, but when I make the announcements, they're like, "Oh my God, your voice is this. Oh my God, your voice is that. You should sing. Oh my God, you have like the best speaking voice." It's like, and I'm like, that's my acting training. And so when I do say, "Can I have your attention?" and when I'm like in the space, like I'm always present to this idea that I have the mic. It's like I have the mic, and so coupled with Amtrak and my work, these are like I find a way constantly to bridge them. And that's a blessing, because sometimes you do your art and you're doing something totally opposite, but it helps because I can get to travel to New York, DC, Chicago, anywhere I want. So that's the I Am Train idea.